Welcome to the From Harm to Healing podcast. I'm your host, Chris Jones, and I'm a therapist who runs the From Harm to Healing treatment program, an online program for men who have engaged in infidelity or compulsive sexual behaviors within the context of an intimate relationship. I started this podcast to illuminate some of the common blind spots within the treatment fields for compulsive sexual behavior or sex addiction through the lens of the deceptive sexuality trauma model. I hope you find this resource enlightening, particularly if you're somebody navigating the pain of betrayal and deception for yourself. Thank you for listening to the From Harm to Healing podcast. In the last episode, I really started introducing in more depth this idea of the 22 rooms, a really key part of this model. And in particular, I broke down the first 3 rooms which make up the covert phase. If you remember, we had this metaphor with the 22 rooms of a DST trauma hospital, a hospital made up of 3 different wards, one ward being the covert phase, another ward being the exposure phase, and then the third ward being the symptom progression phase. So we are now metaphorically moving from that covert phase trauma ward and stepping into the exposure phase trauma ward. I do want to add, again, that this can be very difficult material to hear. It can be very validating, but can also really connect with, really bring up a lot of the pain that has been caused by the deceptive sexuality in this context. And so please make sure you are caring for yourself, taking breaks if you need to, slowing down if you need to, as you absorb some of this stuff. And I will also add again that these rooms in and of themselves, we could spend so much time on each one. There is so much depth there, so much nuance to break down. And so please remember, this is supposed to be an introduction to these ideas so that you have the language for them, so that you know what we are talking about when we refer to the 22 rooms. But in reality, when we are working with these 22 rooms, when we are applying them clinically, we are really slowing down. We are really taking our time to honor the depth and the experience of each room for each individual walking this journey. Having said all of that, for now, let's continue where we were. We're stepping into the exposure phase trauma ward, and we are thinking about each of the treatment rooms that are present in this ward. And we can broadly break them down into 2 parts. We have the injuries, so the rooms that are dedicated to the injuries that have occurred. And then we have the symptoms caused by those injuries. Because if we zoom out a bit and think about this exposure phase again, this is where the 2 realities are colliding, and we're dealing with acute trauma. And acute trauma causes those trauma responses that we've talked about in previous episodes, or what we might call trauma symptoms. So in the covert phase, we were talking about when the 2 realities are still kept separate. What are the impacts that are still occurring, even when the people in the home above don't know about the hidden basement underneath? In this phase, we're talking about that crash. The home above collapses into the basement beneath, as it is discovered, as it is disclosed. A simple way of thinking about that is that in the covert phase, we're really focusing on shaping injuries, that idea of the fumes from the basement poisoning the home above over time. And now we're thinking about impact injuries, that visceral impact of the reality collision that occurs. Now, having said that, we will start in room number 1 with what we call exposure phase integrity abuse shaping. So what we don't want to lose sight of, even as we start focusing more on acute impact, is the ongoing complex trauma shaping that still occurs all throughout this process, both before, during, and after the discovery and disclosure of the basement. So room number 1 was covert phase integrity abuse shaping. Now we have room number 4, exposure phase integrity abuse shaping. And we can ask ourselves the question, how does the integrity abuse potentially change when there has now been a discovery? And what we can think about here is the ways that it might actually ramp up. So rather than being a more passive form of integrity abuse, lying by omission, withholding information, we are now seeing potentially a lot of reactive abuse that might occur, a lot of anger, a lot of dysregulation, a lot of defensiveness or passive aggression, maybe more explicit stonewalling and pulling away because I'm now having to deal with the traumatic consequences of my actions. So we're really dealing with a double whammy of trauma impact here. In these acute impact moments where the partner is discovering that they've been living in a false reality, that something has been hidden from them, and it feels like everything is fracturing, everything is being lost, they are also potentially having to deal with more acute, more intense integrity abuse, which is, instead of giving the partner what they might need in that moment, is giving them the exact opposite. So again, this double whammy, if you like, ongoing integrity abuse and the trauma shaping that causes, in addition to the traumatic impact that is occurring in the moment as things are discovered, as more and more information comes out. And even in that idea of more and more information coming out, that would be one of the common ongoing integrity abuse behaviors as well. The idea of trickle truths or staggered disclosures, the idea of more and more information coming out. It's very rare upon discovery that all of the information is disclosed. It is more likely that there are going to be ongoing incidents, more and more coming out, more traumatic impact over time. Now, I've already named a few behaviors there, but just to run through a bit of a list to give you an idea, what we might see is defensiveness, minimization, rationalization and justification, continued manipulation of the truth, revising facts or history, perhaps blaming the partner or the relationship, assuming the role of victim, pathologizing the partner's reactions, lack of demonstrated remorse or empathy. We might see aggression or intimidation, fault-finding of the partner, verbal abuse or diminishment, callous attitudes towards the partner in her experience. So you can see there a wide range of things which undoubtedly massively increase the traumatic impact that we're talking about in this exposure phase and contribute to that complex trauma shaping over time. If we then start thinking about the next few rooms, we can perhaps consider them as something of a cluster, a group of injuries that occur together. So we started there with room 4 and the ongoing integrity abuse shaping. And now we're thinking about the acute injuries. So it's the context in which that ongoing integrity abuse is happening. So room number 5 looks at discovery trauma, and room number 6 looks at disclosure trauma. We know that in the vast majority of cases, the secret sexual basement is initially discovered rather than disclosed. So it absolutely happens, but it is somewhat rare that a person who has maintained a secret sexual basement will willingly or voluntarily disclose that. It usually occurs because something is discovered. That's what starts bringing it down. And so again, room 5 names this traumatic impact of discovery trauma, the huge, huge acute rupture that occurs when the basement is initially discovered, in addition to the ongoing traumatic impacts that we've just named, where there are staggered disclosures or staggered discoveries, you could say. More and more is discovered over time. More and more pieces of the story of the basement come out. So again, we're thinking acute, but also ongoing trauma in that situation. There is a tendency in this field for clients to talk about their D-Day or their discovery day, so when it was initially discovered. And I think that's absolutely valid and important. But using this way of thinking, it is an ongoing story as well. So there is that D-Day, there is that initial moment in many cases, but so often that is one, albeit hugely significant moment in a bigger story of discovery over time. Room 6, as I mentioned, then talks about disclosure trauma. And in many ways, these two rooms can really overlap because, as I just talked about the story, the series of events of discovery trauma, the reality is, in most cases, that is interlinked with this similar story of disclosure trauma. Because maybe there's a discovery, then a little bit more is disclosed, then something else is discovered, so a little bit more is disclosed. And there's this dance between disclosure and discovery that is occurring and might be occurring for a long period of time. And that is, again, why we then look at things like full therapeutic disclosure as a clinical task to try and contain that process as much as possible and keep it as safe as is possible. But of course, the journey of full therapeutic disclosure itself is another traumatic journey. Going through a disclosure for both partners, but particularly obviously for the betrayed partner, is a hugely traumatic experience. There's a large unknown potentially coming at me in this disclosure document. All sorts of room for speculation and worst fears to come up. And then when it's read to me, again, that traumatic impact of having, in some ways, my understanding of my previous reality taken away as I'm informed about what was really happening. And when I talked about this being a cluster, hopefully we can see how rooms 4, 5, and 6 fit together. So 5 and 6, this interlaced story of disclosure and discovery, and room 4, the ongoing integrity abuse, the patterns of defensiveness, the continued patterns of withholding information being such a big part of that story. So again, acute trauma and complex trauma. As we continue this journey through the rooms, through these exposure phase injury rooms, we then come to room number 7, which is reality and ego fragmentation. And then room number 8, which is relational rupture and attachment injury. So far, we've named the events that occur, the discoveries, the disclosures. We've named the ongoing patterns of harm that might continue, integrity abuse shaping. And in these two rooms, 7 and 8, we're now really looking at what is actually happening, what is causing the trauma in those situations. So what is the actual impact of the discoveries and the disclosures? And why does this so often lead to PTSD-like symptoms and so many of the trauma responses that we're already very familiar with in this work? So starting with this idea of reality and ego fragmentation in room 7, this has been a common theme through so many of the conversations I've had on this podcast, and I've already mentioned it today. The idea that for the betrayed partner, it is not just painful information they are hearing. It is the idea of their very reality and perhaps their own ego, their sense of themselves, who they are, being shattered. This impact between the two realities literally shattering their experience of themselves, of the world, of their relationship, and picturing all the pieces strewn across the floor, broken glass all across the floor. The reality that the partner had lived in, perhaps for decades, for long periods of time, the reality that they had believed in and perhaps trusted in no longer exists. It isn't just tarnished, it no longer exists, it is shattered. So we need to think of this in many ways as a global injury rather than a localized one. And where we see this, I think, really show up and need to understand this is for so many of the men doing this work, their reality is that most of life is still the same. Most of their reality is still the same. There's just this hidden part of that that has now been brought up, exposed to the other people in the home above. But for the partner, it is so often experienced completely differently. As I said, it is experienced that everything is changed. My whole life is perhaps crumbling or destroyed before me. And that is an extremely traumatic experience to live through. We'll often hear partners use metaphors like a tsunami or a house burning down or a car crash, things like that, to really explain this visceral impact that we're talking about. And to perhaps get a better idea of this, we have another metaphor we can use. We refer to the ink in the water, this idea of thinking of the existing reality that the partner was living in as a glass of water, and the exposure or the discovery of the secret sexual basement is like dropping ink into that water. And the point of the metaphor is that it's not like most of the water's still okay and there's a bit of ink in it. The ink permeates everything. All of the water is changed, and we can't just undo it and take that ink back out. Everything is fundamentally changed. This is why for a partner, it will almost always feel like the entire relationship has been based on lies. The entire relationship, their whole trust, their whole vision of the relationship is changed. That is why so often partners cannot look at wedding photos anymore, cannot look at photos of previous holidays or vacations. The meaning to everything has been fundamentally shifted by the impact of the discovery that's occurred. As I briefly touched on, this extends from the external reality to the internal reality. The view of self, the trust in the self, the relationship with the self, trusting in the sufficiency of the self in the relationship, the thoughts, the feelings, the beliefs. There is so much impact here internally for the partner as well. And that is why we refer to it as the reality and ego fragmentation. If we then move on to roommate, which we named as relational rupture and attachment injury, we now move on to the other really significant reason that this is such an acute traumatic experience. So we've looked at so far what happened: discovery, disclosure, reality fragmentation, ego fragmentation. Now we are looking at the extra impact that occurs because of the attachment injury. So in a way, we're moving from the what was done to who it was done by, and why that has such an extra impact here. In simple terms, an attachment injury can be characterized as an abandonment or a betrayal of trust during a critical moment of need. So the idea of trust being involved, it being a primary attachment, that is one of the reasons that childhood trauma is so impactful from our family of origin, or from authority figures, harm caused by authority figures. There's that extra trauma because of who it is doing it, because there is a level of trust in that attachment. We are able to be more harmed by that attachment in a sense. And an attachment injury can act in and of itself as a traumatic event, which can cause post-traumatic stress symptoms, and can also result in insecure attachments and relationship templates moving forward. So to help us understand this in the context of the secret sexual basement or the discovery of a secret sexual reality, we can use another metaphor, which is this idea of the tightrope, the safety net, and the go-to person. So we are all, in one sense, walking on a tightrope of life. We're walking a tightrope. We can fall down. There are threats. There are difficult situations that come up. But if we have the assumption that we will be safe, that we will be caught if we fall from that tightrope, then we feel psychologically stabilized. So if we feel we have a safety net underneath us to catch us, and one of the biggest parts of any person's safety net are their attachment relationships, to know that there are people that can catch me if I fall. And our intimate partner, or our spouse, for example, is very often our primary go-to person. They are the first person potentially that I think of in terms of my safety net, my source of safety and stabilization. And when this type of betrayal occurs, it can feel like that safety net has been taken away. It's one of the reasons we talk about healing in this context requiring safety as a basic foundation, because initially it feels anything but safe. The safety net is taken away. But even more than that, the safety net has been cut, has been pulled away by the very person who was supposed to be the go-to person, who was supposed to be the safest person. And so there's a huge potential here for a very confusing, conflicting attachment instinct or attachment desire in any partner that's experienced this kind of betrayal. The survival instinct when I'm unsafe is to turn to the go-to person, turn to that person for support in times of crisis. But my survival instinct when I'm threatened or abused or harmed by somebody in that position is to defend, to guard against, to pull away. And so that is why it is so normal that we see such conflicting attachment desires, maybe insecure or disorganized attachment templates moving forward. This person is both the go-to person and the abuser in this context. And this is also why any even subtle fear or concern around ongoing infidelity or anything else that might be occurring that I'm not being told about is extremely threatening, extremely destabilizing, because we have to remember it is happening in that context of someone walking across a tightrope with no safety net underneath. Imagine walking across a thin plank of wood, let's say, that's 6 inches above the floor. It would be easy to balance, easy to walk across that. Imagine walking across that same plank, but it's now 20 meters in the air with no safety net underneath. The experience is completely different. And that is what so many partners will describe as the experience of living life given this betrayal, living life without that feeling of safety or something being there to catch them. So those 5 rooms that I've named here, they really give us an understanding of the injuries, the impacts of the exposure phase. And we think of them, as I said, like a cluster, like an overlapping cluster. So what happens? There is the discovery trauma and the disclosure trauma. And then what are the specific impacts or injuries caused by those events? They are the reality fragmentation, the ego fragmentation, and the relational rupture, the attachment injury that occur. So that is where these PTSD-like symptoms so often come from, those specific injuries occurring, those acute impacts. And then through all of that, you have the room number 4, the ongoing integrity abuse and the integrity abuse shaping that is therefore continuing to occur. We now move to the symptom rooms. So looking at the symptoms that occur because of what we've just spoken about. And some of this we will have already spoken about. In fact, I did an episode on trauma responses, safety seeking. So some of this won't be new, but putting it in this room format helps to give us this complete picture of the 22 rooms. So this takes us from room 9 to room 14, which completes this exposure phase trauma ward. And what we're really looking at in these 6 rooms are essentially the symptoms of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of this has been spoken about previously on the podcast. In fact, I did an episode on trauma responses and safety seeking, so some of it won't be new, but it is good to really go through this whole process, really clarify how this fits into the idea of the 22 rooms. So starting with the overview, room 9 refers to intrusions, triggers, and persistent re-experiencing. Room 10, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli. Room 11, alterations in thoughts and mood. Room 12, trauma-related arousal and reactivity. Room 13, distress and functional impairment. And then room 14, dissociative symptoms. And even as I name these, you might be resonating a lot with some of these ideas, but we'll start diving in a little bit more here to room 9, intrusions, triggers, and persistent re-experiencing. First of all, to clarify again what we mean by intrusions and triggers, intrusions are the involuntary, often recurring and intrusive memories of traumatic events. They might also take the form of recurring distressing dreams. They might be flashbacks or other dissociative reactions in which the victim feels or acts as if the events are occurring again. But there's very much a sense in that idea of intrusion of it being unexpected, of it coming out of nowhere. Whereas a trigger refers more to the specific reminders or cues that might occur that activate memories that then cause that reliving that traumatic experience. So triggers will often come from external sources, such as things I see, things I hear, things I smell, places I go to. So the idea, intrusions coming out of nowhere, triggers coming from a specific external source. And the key thing when we think about this room 9 is this idea of re-experiencing, as I've already named it. This is different than remembering or thinking about or dwelling on the past. This is the idea of my nervous system actually becoming dysregulated and me reliving, re-experiencing it as if it is happening again. So I am having the same or similar physiological experiences to what happened in the past, but now in the present. And that is the bit that is unfortunately so often misunderstood here. And I think it doesn't help that we've reduced the word trigger in society in general to something I don't like or something I don't agree with. Like, I was triggered by what that person said. In this context, we're talking about a physiological experience occurring, reliving, re-experiencing the past. So we must always keep in mind that it is normal, it is to be expected for a victim of a traumatic experience to be highly sensitive to any potential threat, to any potential external triggers, and to intrusions that might come out of nowhere. The trauma brain is now filtering information through that lens of survival and safety. And we can also remember that this is generally happening, primarily at least, on a subconscious level. So when the victim is triggered, the prefrontal cortex shuts down. This is not a cognitive process. Again, this is a physiological process that is occurring. And this then naturally leads into the room 10, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli. So if that is the experience of being triggered, it makes perfect sense that I am then going to do everything I can to avoid being triggered. So avoid the stimuli that might lead to that. This might mean physically avoiding certain places, certain situations, or certain people that we know might be triggering. It might involve behaviors or habits that numb us out or help us avoid those feelings. It might be certain things that I don't think about anymore, that I constrict in my mind. I might withdraw from recreational activities that I once enjoyed, or places or people that I used to enjoy. I might be using technology more time on social media, more time watching TV, more time drinking alcohol, whatever it might be, things that help me to avoid the triggers, avoid the distress that might come up. And again, we need to remember that it makes perfect sense that a partner or that a victim of a traumatic experience would want to numb and would want to avoid the psychological pain that is occurring. Safety is the priority, and because of the constant threat of triggers and intrusions, more and more places and things might start to feel unsafe. And the sad outcome of this, in many ways, is that the person's world tends to become smaller and smaller. There are less things that feel safe, so more and more constriction tends to occur in that person's life, both internally and externally. And there can be this catch-22 that therefore occurs where a lot of the things that we know are healthy for us to be doing, to be moving forward in psychological health, become constricted, become things that we're no longer engaging in. And there is, of course, another risk here when we think of the integrity abuse, or we think of how this might even be weaponized against a partner, where it might appear that they are wallowing in their pain, or they're not willing to do the things they need to do to move forward, or however we might word that, that is greatly missing the point of why these kind of behaviors might be occurring. We can move on from there to the next symptom in room 11, negative alterations in thoughts and mood. This might take the appearance of persistent negative beliefs and expectations about the self, or about the relationship, other people, the world in general. So it could be persistent self-blame. There's the intrusions we've mentioned, maybe preoccupation with the secret sexual basement. It might be consistent fear, anger, high levels of anxiety or depression. There's often a lot of grief, a lot of having to come to terms with the loss or mourning the existing reality. There's hypervigilance, rage, flooding of the nervous system, high levels of dysregulation. There might be panic attacks. We mentioned the potential for constriction, so there might be highly constricted emotions, particularly the inability to experience positive emotions. And there can be a deep sense as well of feeling alienated or detached from the world, from others. We mentioned maybe a lack of enjoyment in things that I used to enjoy or people that I used to enjoy. And often just this profound sense of unease or distress that is ongoing, distress about myself, distress about the world. And this can sadly completely shape the lens through which everything, everyone is seen. The way of seeing the world can be fundamentally different because of these negative alterations in thoughts and mood. Room 12 moves forward from there and names trauma-related arousal and reactivity as another symptom. And this somewhat overlaps with what we've already spoken about, but is nevertheless important in its own right as well. So remember that in the post-traumatic state, the victim system is in high arousal. It is in survival mode. And so safety seeking and protection of the self become the primary focus. Any potential threat causes an alarm to go off in the nervous system. So any trigger, any intrusion, any uncertainty about how he is showing up or something he said can cause that alarm to go off. And this is what we sometimes refer to as hypervigilance. So this idea of trauma-related arousal and reactivity is another way of thinking about that. The nervous system is in hyperarousal or very close to hyperarousal so much of the time. And so there is a high degree of reactivity to any perceived threat that is coming up. So if we think of room 9 as the specific triggers and intrusions that might occur, we can also think of this room 12 as the sort of general sense of being on edge, of being very close to the edge of regulation, if you like. And so we expect to see things like irritable, aggressive, even violent behavior, maybe self-destructive or reckless behavior, hypervigilance, as I've mentioned. Maybe even an exaggerated startle response because the nervous system is on edge the whole time. We would expect to often see problems with the ability to concentrate and focus. So cognitive issues in that way. Very likely to see disturbances in people's sleep patterns. And one of the really sad outworkings of this symptom, I believe, is that the person can experience their reactions so intensely, the way they're reacting, that it can cause them to almost have a sense of aversion to who they have become. So a sense of distress, even as they reflect on themselves and who they are now and how they're reacting to things. They might feel alienated from the self. And a lot of these reactionary behaviors, which I want to state again, are expected, are normal when we're thinking about post-traumatic stress. These behaviors might be very contrary to their values. And so, again, leading to feelings of shame, feelings of guilt about the self, about one's behaviors, even if they can be understood through that lens of trauma. Room 13 then names the additional symptom of distress and functional impairment. So what we're really looking at here is the impacts that the trauma might have on the person's ability to function in life in general, the practical impacts it might have. And in this context, when we're thinking about deceptive sexuality and the trauma that's brought to a relationship, to especially a long-term intimate relationship, we can think of the personal impacts. So the trauma I might be experiencing might impact my ability to function, but also all of the extra things that might now need to be considered because of what's occurred in terms of the betrayal. And some of those practical impacts might be changes in living arrangements or sleeping arrangements. There might be temporary or permanent separations involved. There might be new co-parenting arrangement, lots of stuff that might need to be considered around parenting. The need to find resources, find support, therapeutic help. And of course, we can name the financial costs of any of these new arrangements and the potential financial costs of seeking professional support. And then on this more personal level, the ability to work or be productive in whatever the person would normally have been doing might be greatly diminished. So the ability to fulfill roles, fulfill obligations, given the presence of the trauma, might become extremely difficult. And there's also other practical considerations, like who do we disclose to? Who can we be honest with about what's happening? Because if we don't tell anybody, then the partner is so often forced to essentially cope on their own, to suppress it all, maybe to pretend things are okay to people looking in from the outside. Whereas if someone does decide to disclose, to share with people around them, it can bring up all sorts of shame, embarrassment, maybe the shame of choosing to stay in the relationship if you're attempting to move forward, to work towards healing. There's also the risk that the partner is pathologized even by people that she thought might have come to her aid or supported her. It might be that the social misrepresentation of the relationship that is so often part of the integrity abuse pattern does make her look like the crazy one or the one with the problems in that situation, especially when we're thinking of trauma responses. So we know that can be weaponized as well, and that is a big risk of disclosing what's going on. And really linking to that idea, this is another really sad thing, I think, about the treatment field and this journey in general. The partner so often is the one left behind or the one having to hold down the fort. The addict or the abuser is so often the one prioritized in treatment and usually has a lot more treatment options available to them. So the partner might feel the need to suppress what's going on, try and just soldier on and, as I said, hold the fort down, keep things going. Has to continue parenting, has to continue doing all of the roles, the things that were part of life before, but now carrying all of this trauma and pain that is really impacting the ability to do those things. And then that leads straight into our final room for this exposure phase trauma ward, room 14, dissociative symptoms. Especially if someone feels that they need to suppress what's going on, there can be that submerging of the trauma, the constriction of the feelings associated with it. It is very common for different forms of dissociation to become more present for that person. This, of course, has some overlap with the idea we've already spoken about of avoidance of trauma-related stimuli. But we can now consider other forms of dissociation that might be present. So this could come under the guise of alterations in consciousness, so transient dissociative episodes, those times when someone psychologically actually experiences a depersonalization or derealization, feeling acutely disconnected from the self or from their world. It can, of course, include the re-experiencing of traumatic events, which can be so intense that the person is essentially dissociating in that moment. They are so in that traumatic re-experience. And of course, we know that there's likely to be a high degree of rumination about the traumatic events or preoccupation about the traumatic events that have occurred. So that might not be a full dissociation, but it still might be taking over someone's thinking to such a degree that they are less connected with life in general. Dissociation might also come from a somewhat conscious place, or at least semi-conscious, as a form of denial, where a person is in some sense of denial as a way of coping with their present reality, of being in an ongoing relationship with the person that has caused so much harm to them. So sometimes disconnecting from that, or even in some sense sweeping it under the rug, or even in themselves, minimizing what's occurring, again, as a way of denial to cope with the present reality. And we know that the power differential in the relationship, another thing we've talked about previously, plays such a significant role here. If it feels like there is no means of escape, or it's a relationship that's very difficult to leave, maybe for logistical reasons, maybe for financial reasons, or whatever it might be, then it makes even more sense that denial or dissociation in that way might be used as a way to cope with that ongoing reality. So that really brings us to the end of our exploration of that exposure phase trauma ward. And as you'll have seen, there is so much there. Again, I can say that each one of those rooms we could probably spend an hour talking about and not run out of things to say. And for many people listening to this episode, you will have perhaps really connected with some of those ideas, and you will have your own acute and complex trauma story in many of those rooms. And so to you, I hope that this is illuminating. I know it can be painful to hear this, but I hope it is illuminating. I hope it is validating. And I hope it can even give you some structure, or even some words, some phrases, some metaphors that connect with, allow you to voice what has happened. So as we've gone through that exposure phase, we've had those impact rooms or injury rooms. So we looked at, starting with room number 4, the exposure phase integrity abuse shaping. Then room number 5, the discovery trauma. Then room number 6, the disclosure trauma. Then looked at room number 7, the reality and ego fragmentation. And room number 8, the relational rupture and attachment injuries. So all of those cluster of injuries really laying out what is happening, what is causing that acute trauma that occurs when a secret sexual basement is discovered. And then moving on to those 6 symptom rooms, which for anyone walking this path, you will probably have an intimate awareness of. But room number 9, intrusions, triggers, and persistent re-experiencing. Room 10, avoidance of trauma-related stimuli. Room 11, alterations in thoughts and mood. Room 12, trauma-related arousal and reactivity. Room 13, distress and functional impairment. And room 14, dissociative symptoms. In the next episode, we'll move on to the 3rd and final trauma ward, the symptom progression phase trauma ward. And this is where we're thinking about, as we move forward from this exposure phase, whether that's towards recovery and healing or whether it's not, we need to consider what are the ongoing traumatic impacts, the short, medium, and then long-term impacts we need to be aware of in terms of deceptive sexuality and deceptive sexuality trauma. So I thank you for listening today. I hope this has been illuminating, and I will speak to you in the next episode. Thank you for listening to this episode of the From Harm to Healing podcast. If you'd like to find out more information about the deceptive sexuality trauma model itself, you can visit minwalamodel.com. If you're interested in the services that I offer, in particular the From Harm to Healing treatment program, please visit chrisjonestherapy.co.uk.